All right, let's talk about fish and shellfish production, which is a rapidly growing industry. Fisheries um, are 30% overfished, meaning like a natural fishery where we are able to pull the supply for a particular type of fish and a food that is very traditional for a lot of societies. And there's a concentration of particular species that is like suitable for commercial harvesting, but like traditionally it would be there. And what's happening as populations are growing, the demand for fish from societies that would traditionally have fished them themselves, it's the demand is shifting to commercially produced or commercially supplied fish harvests as societies are changing and growing. 57% of fisheries are harvested at full capacity. So in terms of like we talk about sustainable yield, we're topping out on this. It is we're like we're going to start overfishing, even worse if we don't introduce a change. So then agriculture is basically farming fish. So they're not it's not a natural fishery, but the goal is to increase the amount of fish and shellfish that are produced within these like contained situations. And aquaculture has increased 12-fold from the 1980s through the teens, and wild catch leveled off and has declined. um, Farming of meat-eating species is growing really rapidly. So these are um, not just like fed, plant pellets or sometimes with like insect pellets, but farming of fish that are meat-eating fish. These fish have to be fed other fish or fish oils, and so understanding that producing something higher on the food chain requires more energy, and the reality is um, that as wild catch is leveled off, aquaculture production of fish has just started to take off. One of the things to know is that it takes 10 units of fossil fuel energy for every unit of food energy that is produced. So that's an investment of fossil fuel energy needed to get out the food energy. The amount of energy per calorie in the United States has declined 50% since the 1970s because there's less energy required to produce nitrogen fertilizers. And we've got the a rise in conservation tillage and things that are like industry practice changes as awareness of like what's better for the environment and what's better for conservation of energy is actually kind of infiltrating into the industry. So that's one of the environmental effects, just really like the use of energy, right? Like having to use fossil fuels. But beyond that, a lot of factors may limit future food production because the environment begins to degrade. And as we talked about before, that full pricing the full cost pricing isn't it hasn't been addressed, and it's not been worked into the cost of food. And so we kind of now we look at there's a lot of issues that have to be dealt with. So soil erosion and degradation, desertification, irrigation, water shortages, air pollution, water pollution, climate change, and overall a loss of biodiversity are some of the problems that we are facing that have come out of the industrialized food production industry. Industrialized agriculture has harmful environmental impacts. It uses 70% of fresh water, that it's like 70% of the fresh water that actually comes out of aquifers or the surface water, it's used for agriculture. It emits 25% of the world's overall greenhouse gas emissions, and it produces 60% of all of the water pollution. Now, I get it, like we have to feed the world, but these are impacts that we need to mitigate. Like there has to be a change. So there are technologies and there are practices that are coming into this industry, but it's a slow change as you have a lot of kind of like working pieces. So these are the natural capital issues. So we talk about natural capital is like biodiversity is natural capital, soil is natural capital, water, fresh water is natural capital. That is stuff that we have that is a benefit to us. That's our those are our riches, our natural riches. Clean air, right? So this degradation does have costs attached to it. Um, Topsoil erosion is one of biggest problems. So soil, we know, is a really complicated process, like the production of soil, and soil, it has a lot of living components to it. So the movement of soil, like once it's gone, it takes a really long time to replenish. Soil erosion does happen through natural causes, but every time we till and pull up plant material, we did that soil erosion activity. You understand that when you have exposed soil, that the erosion is so much faster. And so when we're looking at agriculture as the activity that's happening on that soil, we're going to cause that. I mean, we're going to cause more erosion just by using the land. Three major harmful effects of soil erosion: we have loss of soil fertility, you get water pollution, and then anything that was holding that soil in place as a plant, now we've lost that plant matter. There's a release of carbon just from the plant matter, but then there's also a release of carbon from the soil as it begins to off gas and further decomposition and all of those processes, where if it was being held by natural plant matter, that's like buried, and a lot of that CO2 would uh, be held in place. Once you begin to turn it up, then we get more CO2 and methane and things that come out of the soil. So you can see the effects of soil erosion here. That haziness is dust, and that is definitely not a healthy situation for the air. But it also indicates that there is a movement of soil that is going to be detrimental for the overall life of that land. So these are areas that have serious problems attached to the movement of soil. These are areas that we often see um, famine and or threats to crop production happening. This, what you probably are more familiar with is like the Dust Bowl and what happened in the Depression in the Midwest. And so, anytime we have like movement of the vegetation that is holding the soil in place, then you interrupt that natural ecology. So what can happen as a result of that, though, is a process that is like positive feedback loop runaway. When you lose the plant matter, you lose some of the water holding capacity, and that can lead to what's called desertification. The production or the productive potential of that soil falls by 10% or more, and it can be caused by prolonged drought, but it can also just be caused by human activities. And once desertification sets in, it's really difficult to come back from. The land has to have an input of organic matter and water to heal, but sometimes like taking the organic matter out of it takes away from the capacity that it has to heal. So human agriculture really accelerates desertification. um, Another problem with soil is that when we do bring in water, that often that water does have um, you know natural salts that have been dissolved into it, and soil salinization can happen. This is a gradual accumulation of salts from that irrigation water. It lowers crop yields, and it can eventually kill plants. It affects 10% of the world's croplands. Waterlogging happens when irrigation water gradually raises a water table, and it can deprive plants of oxygen. So, like if you're constantly putting water into a system and it's actually bringing the water table up, it can touch onto the roots of plants. Like often we don't think about this, but if soil doesn't allow water to drain all the way through it, plants that are not adapted for aquatic systems can't have their roots be sitting in water all the time. They actually drown. And so they're suffocated by that water the same way that we would drown. And the waterlogging affects 10% of the world's croplands. And this as a human intervention of like irrigation becomes an unintended consequence of excessive irrigation. And so you can see the effects of that creating problems with the soil here. This particular picture um, let me see. Whoops. Where did it go? Oh, I must have closed my little notes box. Well, that's a bummer. Okay. All right. Um, Eroded topsoil flows into streams. Farmers contribute also, by putting those synthetic fertilizers. And so the cycle of pollution, eroded material, synthetic fertilizers, all these agricultural activities can really compound the environmental damage. And so agricultural activities comprise more than 25% of human generated CO2 emissions. Producing food and producing even biofuel reduces biodiversity. We talked about monoculture. Biodiversity is threatened when forests and grasslands are replaced by this monoculture cropland. I know I showed the video about um, the orangutan and the threat to orangutans. One of the biggest ones is the loss of their land so that it can be used to grow um, the palm oil plants. So agrobiodiversity is where there's a genetic variety of animal and plant species that are used on farms to produce food, but we have lost agrobiodiversity and we've really moved toward monoculture. So there's been a 75% loss in using farmland in a variety of ways since the 1900s. Efforts to save endangered crop varieties have become kind of a big industry thing. We actually refrigerate seed banks trying to hold on to some of the more natural strains of our crops that we used to have, but because there's been such changes. So genetic engineering, we know that it's efficient. We know that it can improve food security, but we don't really understand the long-term health effects, that there's things that can cause biological changes that we aren't even really aware of. And there's little biochemical shifts within organisms that are modified genetically or engineered, and it's a big, like, mysterious, like, black box. Like, we don't really understand all of what's happening biologically with that food, but we also don't really understand what's happening in terms of the potential environmental effects, where we're taking genetically modified populations and putting them out in nature, and like, we cannot control pollination. We cannot control that cross contamination in terms of genes moving from these modified hybrids into organic foods. And I think, don't necessarily understand what we're playing with here. It's not it. I'm not saying that we should run around being afraid of it. I just think that we need to be really careful. But that's my thoughts on it. So you have to form your own thoughts and understanding what genetically modified crops are, and what the costs and benefit, or the possible drawbacks, and the possible takeaways for us as a society really is it's an up and coming question. So you can take a look at this, the trade-offs for GMOs versus what we traditional heirloom varieties of foods. And we know that there still is a limit to what we can produce. So most green revolution and genetically engineered crop varieties require large inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, and water. Oftentimes they are not as resistant to particular pests. They're not as robust or healthy as some of they have certain traits that are better, but then there's a loss of other traits. And so the other aspect is that there's an industry and a corporation involved in developing GMO foods and seeds, and they're trademarked and they are copyrighted, and the rights to those genetic varietals are not owned by the farmers. If a farmer were to take natural seeds and selectively breed, then they're in charge of those, and that is like their intellectual work and intellectual property. Well, now when you take something that's been developed in a lab, there's intellectual property rights and there's money attached to getting access to those seeds. But oftentimes farmers do not own the seeds. They can plant the seeds, but they are not allowed to selectively breed. And so there's a lot of strange legal issues that come into genetically engineered food varieties as well. And the produce yields no higher than traditional strains. And so a lot of times, kind of like, skeptics of this process are like, what's the deal? Like, we're getting one little benefit that we could pull out from naturally developing a strain that would resist this or resist that. And we're also introducing like litigation and corporate rights and intellectual properties and trademarks and copyrights and things that make this really complicated, and aren't feeding our poor. It's not any better.